Have you ever heard of Chekhov's gun? Anton Pavlovich Chekhov was a Russian playwright and short story writer in the late 19th century. Most of the topics he wrote about are well beyond the scope of this humble YouTube video about Dungeons and Dragons, but this subject in particular is essential in understanding the concepts of planting, payoff, and foreshadowing. In this case, we're going to be talking about Chekhov's gun. Chekhov's gun, as a concept, can be summarized like this. And there's a direct quote, and I don't have it, so I'm going to be misquoting for all of you sticklers out there. If you put a gun on stage in the first act, it should go off by the end of the play. This is one of those simple sounding statements that nonetheless has a lot to tell us about telling a story to our players, about giving them a satisfying experience from beginning to end. This idea has everything we need to understand the concepts of planting and payoff and foreshadowing, pretty important ideas overall, but in order to understand them, we have to first dissect them. So let's take this piece by piece. Now, when Mr. Chekhov sat down to talk about his eponymous gun, he was talking about a number of different things. For example, storytelling efficiency, editing, pacing, that sort of thing. But in this case, we're going to be discussing specifically the planting and payoff aspects. Now, sitting down to make this episode took me a million years because I couldn't figure out what it was that I wanted to say about Chekhov's gun. Why this concept was important to us as dungeon masters. The answer that I came across in my ponderings was this. Chekhov's gun and the concepts that it represents are an important storytelling tool to add to your dungeon master's toolbox. And this is a good segue into a segment that I like to call Why Do We Care? We all know stories that feel cheap. There's an entire term to describe this feeling in storytelling, which is deus ex machina, something that we're all familiar with in stories that we have found unsatisfying. Stories that we have seen that have seemed to cheat in some way. Chekhov's gun, and by extension the rule of planting and payoff, is how we avoid having our stories or our games feel cheap. It's how we avoid having something seem like it comes out of nowhere. Like, for example, our players are in dire straits and are about to die, and then all of the sudden a giant eagle swoops out of nowhere and rescues them from the side of Mount Doom. That can be avoided by proper planting and payoff. The goal of this is to have every important element in your story connect. Connect not only to itself in the narrative, but connect to the world at large. This is an essential part of building a story and a world that makes sense. You can think of this as hooking up the wiring of your story to make sure that everything has power. Another reason we care about planting and payoff is that this is a way to make things in your story and your world seem cool, seem consequential, and seem like they have gravity. Chekhov's gun and the wider storytelling rules that it implies are an essential part of making your story matter. So to begin talking about the mechanics of a Chekhov's gun, we need to examine each part individually. First off, what is a gun? In a broader metaphorical sense, not in a literal sense, you goon. In a narrative sense, a gun is anything that has narrative weight. Typically something with implied consequence. If you take a gun, for example, the purpose of a gun is to fire and hurt somebody or kill them. Similarly, anything that fits the role of a gun in your narrative is something that has a chain of events with an inevitable conclusion. I've written down here an object or idea that hints to your players about trouble down the line. When picking this gun, which is to say picking the narrative focus of your story or game, you're looking for something that constrains the outcome of the situation while leaving the middle of it uncertain. The example that I have written down in my script here is that you know point A and you know point Z, but everything in the middle is uncertain. So, in Dungeons and Dragons or an equivalent tabletop role-playing game, what counts as a good gun? There are a couple of things that you should be focusing on when picking the narrative focus of your game in this manner. Dungeons and Dragons has a whole slew of things that you can choose from that would behave very well as a Chekhov's gun. You have a range of eldritch horrors and arcane tools and weapons, superpowered villains, and sinister cults. The trick is, you want something that is about to happen, rather than something that is currently happening right now. The difference between the two is the difference between a plot point and a backdrop. Say, for example, you have an invading orc army. Now, if they've already invaded, that counts more as a backdrop than a narrative focus. It's the context in which the events of the campaign play out. On the other hand, if you're using an invading orc army as a Chekhov's gun, then the orc army hasn't yet invaded. They're thinking about it and they're threatening to, but they haven't come down on the kingdom yet. Rather, the party should be trying to prevent their invasion, or maybe encourage their invasion, depending on the alignment of your party and players and their individual inclinations. Either way you play it, there's an uncertain chain of events that leads towards a certain outcome. And, importantly, your players understand what that outcome is going to be. Or might be, unless they avert it, or encourage it. Either way. When picking a Chekhov's gun in this scenario, you're looking for something that has consequence. Something that will impact the setting or the cast of characters in a tangible and real way. A good way to test whether your narrative focus counts as a Chekhov's gun is to see whether or not that object will have an impact on the events of the story. If the gun goes off, will there be a consequence, rather than if the gun goes off, will the status quo be maintained? So once you've picked the narrative focus for your game or your campaign or story, how do you introduce it? How do you tell your players that this thing is of consequence? How do you put the gun on stage? In the case of a firearm, your work is done for you. The audience already understands that the object you've placed on stage has a purpose and has a specific chain of events that will lead to a specific conclusion. The details of the conclusion are, of course, up for debate, which is the course of the play and the chain of events that it portrays, but you know that a gun shoots a bullet. But when you're picking something for Dungeons and Dragons, your options are much more varied and therefore much more difficult to make sure that your players understand the consequences of them. I don't know if that was grammatically correct. It's much more difficult to tell your players the threat that an owlbear poses, as opposed to a firearm. When you're picking your Chekhov's gun, it's important to show your players the potential consequences of this object or idea. When you're building this, you have to establish a chain of cause and effect. Make sure your players see and understand what happens when this gun goes off. Perhaps at the beginning of the campaign, the players see the evil baron kicking a prisoner into the pit, and then they see a gout of blood erupting from beneath. The players know that there is something horrifying in the pit that is incredibly violent, that has nobody's best interests in mind, and they also understand on some level that they're probably going to go into the pit at some point. As a dungeon master, you have a great deal of flexibility that you can use to introduce the concepts presented by your Chekhov's gun. You can be as subtle or as blatant as you want to be. I mean, heck, you can even say, holy cow guys, there's a dang old dragon up in the hills that will fly down and ruin the town unless you perform a certain ritual. Or, on the other hand, you can show subtly the effects of the Chekhov's gun without telling your players what it is that they're seeing. So the third part of this puzzle, with any Chekhov's gun that you might come up with, is figuring out when the gun goes off. This is the trickiest part of any narrative structure, but it can be thought of in conceptually simple terms. My favorite example of this is the old story Bluebeard. In case you're not familiar with this story, it's about a horribly abusive man who marries a young woman and goes off on vacations, leaving her alone in the house, and tells her that there's one door that she can't open, but there's also like a key right there. And then the lady's like, oh my god, what's behind the one door that I can't open? She unlocks it and opens it, and there are the heads of the former wives of this person, Bluebeard. And he came home and is like, hey, you unlocked the door. Time to kill you. That's the worst. That is the worst retelling of Bluebeard probably ever. So the structure of the story of Bluebeard is you show the audience that there is something behind a door that the audience can't see. You have, in effect, put something on stage that will go off at some point. The gun goes off when the main character in the story, which is Bluebeard's wife, goes to unlock the door after months of curiosity. And the payoff of the thing that you planted is the fact that behind the door are the bodies of all the other wives who unlocked the door before this current wife. The point of this rambling discourse is that that particular Chekhov's gun goes off when somebody decides to pull the trigger, when the chain of events leads to its inevitable conclusion. A Chekhov's gun should go off when it makes the most sense for the story. This is something that's hard to pin down. Maybe somebody out there has done a better job of establishing this than I have, but as lifetime audiences of a number of different stories, we all have a certain amount of instinct for when this makes the most sense. The gun goes off when the waveform collapses. The gun goes off when there are no other options but to pull the trigger. It's important for you, as a dungeon master, to therefore understand what the trigger conditions are for your Chekhov's gun. This is like, for you programmers out there, the if-then statement of this particular narrative object. What trigger conditions will provide the most narrative impact? If the threat is dealt with long before it ever becomes an issue, then it doesn't make a super compelling narrative. But if the bad guy makes it all the way to the end without being stopped and is about to unlock the Eldritch Horror, or if he manages to unlock the Eldritch Horror while your players are standing there, that's a much more compelling point for somebody to pull the trigger. Think of it maybe like, when will the most people see it? When will this make the biggest splash? This is the payoff section of the planting and payoff duo. This comes partly from instinct, partly from improvisation, and partly from planning. You have to have some idea of what the consequences of your Chekhov's gun will be without maybe knowing when exactly those consequences will come into play. If any of my players are watching this, don't, because this gives away a lot of my secrets, there's always the possibility of introducing something earlier and bringing it back on an improvisational basis. As a culmination, on top of all of the things that I've been talking about throughout the course of this video, I want to introduce a concept that is unique to iterative storytelling games like Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games in general that I like to call Chekhov's Arsenal. Something that is unique to storytelling situations in which you as the storyteller are reacting to the actions and thoughts of the audience. In this case, your players. This is something that can be used to introduce a number of narratively consequential elements that you keep in your back pocket that can pay off whenever your players trigger them. This relies much less on a rigorous narrative structure, as Chekhov's gun typically does, and relies more on having your players stumble across the trigger settings and having that course of events play out as you thought about them beforehand. So, for example, your players are on a quest and they hear a legend that doesn't really have much to do with the quest line in general that they think they're on. The legend is maybe, to go back to an example that I've used previously, on the harvest moon, a scary monster comes out to terrorize the countryside. Perhaps it comes to pass that your players are out on the quest and night falls, and the moon begins to rise, and they realize, with a sinking sense of dread, that it's the full harvest moon. Suddenly, they hear a howling off in the distance, and realize that they are miles from any safe haven. This is a situation in which you have something established beforehand, but you weren't quite sure when it was going to pay off. In a collaborative game like Dungeons & Dragons, it's important to have a number of these elements in place to make sure that the world and the game and the events that all of these things represent have weight and have gravity. Seeding your game with a number of these Chekhov's guns in your Chekhov's arsenal, that's the stupidest. Having a number of these seeds can give your players a number of reasons to care about the world in more than just a quest line sort of way. And by that I mean, they pick up a quest at the inn, but also hear a rumor that there is a wild owl bear on the loose. The wild owl bear might not have anything to do with rescuing the miners from the collapsed mine, but it's something that the players have to pay attention to. In my most recent game, I introduced the concept that there was an area of this abandoned city that was overrun by dreams that had escaped from the unconscious of the people who had lived there before. This was a reason why the city was abandoned and ruined, was that you dreamed about horrible things and then they came to life and it was really terrible and nobody liked it. The players were faced with this procession of hooded and robed people carrying a giant's head on a platter. They carried this head, which was very much still alive, because horrifying dream logic, and I thought that would be a good squicky thing to face my players with. They carried this head towards an open well, and then they tossed this head in, and the players heard in a long dead language someone saying, "Oh, I don't like it when people are in my dream city, and oh no, look out, oh, I'm very scary and big. And I'm coming out of the well at some point." But nothing further happened that night. Then, a couple of sessions later, the players were taken prisoner by the big bad. All hope seemed lost. But then, out of nowhere, they heard a deep rumbling. Words spoken in that same dead language, in that same booming dead voice. Out of the mists of this dream city came a headless giant, swinging their head like a weapon, crashing it into buildings. The giant then threw their head at the airship the players were prisoner on, giving the players a chance to escape in the chaos. One of my players was like, "Oh my god, you planted that 2 sessions ago, and it paid off just now." And I was like, "Yep, I planned that thing the whole time." But in Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing in general, the trick is that you're never quite sure when or how these things are going to pay off. The important thing is you plant them so that they can pay off later down the line when you think they're going to be handy. To peel back the curtain on that particular Wizard of Oz, I was never sure when that giant was going to pay off. This giant could have as easily been a boss fight as they were a set piece, depending on my players' actions. You never know the ways your players are going to behave, but you can think ahead of them in a way that you've pre-programmed these moments of narrative weight in your story before the game begins. So, to summarize everything that I've told you, Chekhov's gun is a narrative element that is used in conventional storytelling to give something narrative focus and weight. You do this by planting something beforehand that will pay off later on down the line. A gun, for example, pays off by going off. A good Chekhov's gun is anything that has some sort of narrative conclusion. Showing this Chekhov's gun to your audience is a matter of making your audience understand the consequences that this gun represents. Your responsibility as a storyteller or a dungeon master or a keeper of arcane lore, if you're a Call of Cthulhu player, is to make sure that your players understand the consequences at the end of this chain of events. Making this gun go off is a matter of understanding when in the story it feels best for this particular thing to happen. The unique application that I'm talking about, Chekhov's Arsenal, is something that represents a slew of seeds that you have planted. You're not sure exactly when these seeds are going to bear fruit, but you do know that you're letting these plants grow to the point when it makes the most sense to show the fruit to your players. This is the practice of seeding your game and story with narratively weighty elements, things that have gravity, and things that your players have to consider as they go about playing your game. Tabletop gaming is a much different experience than trying to put together a cohesive and well-edited single-string narrative, because it's a give and a take. You are not solely responsible for the narrative that you're putting in front of the players. Your only responsibility is to make sure that the narrative that your players are interacting with has consequence. That's why I recommend having a number of Chekhov's guns in your Chekhov's arsenal anytime you sit down to make a campaign. I'm Dungeon Master Lee. I don't know if that was a good conclusion, but this has been another episode of Dungeon Master You, where you are the Dungeon Master. If you have any great examples of this that you've put forward in your own game, I would love to hear about them. Contact me on Twitter or in the comments below and let me know how this has played out in your games. I love to hear about this stuff. And, as always, Dungeon Masters, stay adventurous. Farewell! How do people sit? How do people sit in chairs? I don't know. I've never really known. Usually I perch and loom.